Okay, we can start. Okay. Gideon Mendel, welcome to this face-to-face of the ArtCOP21 here in Paris. Every afternoon we invite an international artist feeling involved in the question of global warming. Gideon Mendel, you are a photographer. You were born in South Africa, living today in London. You studied psychology and African history. You have worked for many magazines, and since the year 2007, you have been working about climate change through this project named Drowning World. A reign of prestigious prizes on this project, and a lot of water during this time is rising on the head of these people you photographed. So you can present us some of your photos.
Hi everybody. I guess you can see screens in each direction. What I thought I would first... Okay, can you hear me? Okay, what I thought I would start with, before we get into the discussion, because I'm not sure how much you all know about my work in Drowning World, is to give you a sense of the various narratives, the various elements of the project. I've been working on the project for nearly 9 years now, and it's grown and mutated and developed, and it began, I suppose, in the region of somewhere being something partly photojournalistic, partly activist, and it's mutated, and I think it's become a lot less photojournalistic. There's a lot more of a kind of art and a kind of metaphorical. It's become much more metaphorical, and it's grown a whole lot of new kind of arms and legs. It's become a bit of a kind of octopus for me, with many different aspects. So I thought I would, if we get the screens up, I'll show you the different elements. Now, the main central spine of the project is something which I call submerged portraits. And we'll come back later to talk about how this all happened. But essentially, I've photographed floods in 12 different countries and actually made 14 different trips over all the years to photograph floods. And the main thing I do is something a little bit counterintuitive. And that is I do portraits of flood victims in the context of their homes, if possible. It's I guess, not what people expect a photographer to do in a flood situation. But for me, it's become a kind of obsession, is building up this collection of portraits from floods around the world. And I photographed in 2007 the UK and India. In 2008 I photographed in Haiti. In 2010 I photographed in Pakistan. In 2011 I photographed in Thailand and Australia. In 2012 I photographed in Nigeria. In 2013 I photographed in Germany and the Philippines. In 2014 I went back to the UK and to India, to floods again. And this year I photographed in Brazil, Bangladesh, and the United States. So that's quite a journey. But you'll see now, what I'll show you is the solution I came to in terms of my arrangement, because I've spent months trying to figure out how to sequence the pictures. In a gallery context, in a website sequence, is how do I arrange them by country? Do I arrange them by groupings? Do I arrange them by mixing the nationalities, the different races, nationalities, and nothing really worked until I found the solution, which is really to arrange the pictures purely on the basis of water level, as I can adjust, as I can see them. So I've arranged the sequence, you'll see, from the highest to the lowest water level, covering all the countries. So I'll quickly take you through my set of, I suppose, of my favorite images. And I guess the countries are sort of fairly obvious. And that's one of the most recent pictures, done just about 5 weeks ago in South Carolina. So, ending in a picture which I took in Haiti in 2009. And when I present the photographs, I always, certainly in many contexts, like in gallery contexts and other contexts, I don't necessarily give a lot of information, but I always try to present people's name and where they're from and the kind of the date. This is the only picture of all the pictures I've taken where I don't have the name of the person in the photograph. This one over here. And when I was in Haiti, I was struggling through the mud, and I saw this boy, and I took one frame of him, and then he disappeared, and I could never find him again. So it's the only picture without a name. So I've taken you through the kind of, I suppose what I see is the main kind of spine of the project, which are these submerged portraits. And I'll take you through some of the other elements now. And this is what I call the waterlines section. And I've photographed, I suppose I've made a number of fairly abstract pictures where I'm looking at the sense of the line of the water or the line left behind by the water. You'll see what I mean. So they are sometimes kind of strange, relatively abstract pictures, and sometimes even with a little bit of humor. You know, I love the sense of the ducks floating in the water above the water line. And this leads me into another section which has developed and I suppose become increasingly an obsession for me, is something which I call watermarks. And it began in Australia when I got to the flood. They actually got to the flood in 2011. It was a huge flood in Queensland, but it didn't last very long. It went up above the roofs of houses, and then within a day it was gone. And there was an immediate industrial process of everything being stripped out of the houses and being thrown away. And at the end of the day, when a whole lot of furniture and possessions had been carted off to the dump, I found a pile of photographs left on the floor. And I've become increasingly kind of beguiled by the kind of impact of floodwaters on personal snapshots. So I've got a collection now of a few hundred, and for me they're quite sad objects with a very kind of intense presence, and they sometimes weird, sometimes painterly, and there's been no intervention by me. This is purely the effect of the water on the photograph. And sometimes they're tied to very particular households, in that, people I've met and photographed have kind of have loaned me or given me their pictures. Some, like this, I've got a whole pile of passport pictures, which in Kashmir we found just floating in the water past us. We were in a boat, and a whole number of passport pictures we just plucked out of the water. So some are completely, completely found. I've got no idea, no way to connect them to where they come from, and some are connected to very particular families. I just had a show at the Lianzhou Photo Festival in China, where I showed about 20 of these, and in showing them in a gallery context, for me it was very important to show the edges, to kind of, we made beautiful prints, but to actually show them in a way that shows their kind of their, how to call it, their objectness, to show that it's a reproduction of an object. So we worked very hard to kind of emphasize the corners and the edges of the images. This is Shirley Armitage, who I photographed, and was one of the portraits you saw earlier. And this was her, she said, her third and final failed wedding. So she was quite pleased to be rid of the picture. And these are from a German family who wouldn't let me take the pictures, but allowed me to photograph them, and that was a German wartime wedding. And I've arranged them in a sequence of increasing abstraction. For me, the sequence is always something which is very important to me. This is a picture I found amidst the wreckage in Tacloban in the Philippines after the immense destruction we witnessed there 2 years ago. And so I've got no idea of what the fate was of this person who's sort of slightly represented in the picture. It was literally fished out of the rubble and the mess. And sometimes one loses all sense of the photograph, and it becomes almost like a strange abstract painting. And I'll just take you through some recent scenes in Paris, which is quite strange for me, seeing the work amidst the kind of Parisian architecture.
Did you appreciate the places of your? Did you appreciate the places of your photos in Paris?
Yes, I mean, I didn't choose the locations, but they were very central, and a lot of them were very wealthy sort of locations. Which, but I think, I mean, it's very hard to know because nobody seems to look at billboards. It was hard to know what sort of impact they were making, but they certainly looked. They were in quite interesting contexts. I was able to say this was the first time my work was shown at the Louvre. This is the Disturb series of photographs. I think they've got 30 photographs by 30 different photographers being plastered up in Paris at the moment. So I photographed that this morning. And just to give you a small sense of how I work, it's kind of you can see it's quite extreme. And I work with I shoot the stills with old Rolleiflex cameras, which is a kind of mad thing to do. It makes my life very difficult, but it forces me into a kind of rigor, which I think helps make the pictures sometimes a little bit magical. Finally, what I thought I was going to show you is something of the video element of the project. And over the 9 years that I've been working on Drowning World, the video component has become increasingly important. And I've made a series of what I call water chapters. So for the last 5 or 6 countries I've been to, I've made a short film. And although the photographs work in a lot of different contexts, that they work in galleries, they work in the media, they work as part of activism, the video, because the way I make and I shoot it, tends to sit most comfortably in a gallery context. I'm never trying to make a documentary. I'm always trying to work in a way that's kind of quite slow and quite emotional. And what I'm going to give you a preview of is, this is just a test I've done for a 5-screen video installation. I'm hoping to get the support to make a sort of 20 to 30-minute piece, which will put together my video work from 10 different countries. The concept which I initially had was to make a grid of 9 screens, with 1 screen belonging to every country. And I spent a lot of time talking about that and trying to promote that idea. But when we sat down to try actually make it work, it was too narrow, and I was too tied into a narrow way of doing things. So we came to a kind of, the editor, a friend of mine, after much fighting, we came to a 5-screen solution, which is 5 screens arranged in a line. Sorry, the technical people, do we have sound? You can't make a sound. Could you connect the sound for me? Okay. I'll keep talking. Okay, so while we wait for a sound connection, so
we see that you are like a waterproof photographer, but your equipment is all made for it, or not at all?
I've lost a couple of cameras along the way.
Oh.
I've had a few water disasters. I've learned certain lessons. The one lesson I've learned is never be holding 2 cameras at the same time. When I was working in Srinagar and Kashmir, I was following someone, and I was shooting with a video camera, and I had a brand new 5D Mark III around my neck. And I was following directly in his footsteps, but he must have walked over a ditch, so I fell into a ditch which went up to here as I was following him. So the video camera kept out of the water, but my other camera, the 5D, went into the water and was totally messed up. When I was working in Haiti many years ago, in the space of half an hour, I had 2 Rolleiflex cameras. One of them went into the water because it was raining, and the leather strap broke. And I retrieved it very quickly, but it was in the water. And then half an hour later, I was photographing, and I had my other camera on a tripod. And my so-called assistant, who was not great, then he turned around and he knocked over the tripod. And so I had 2 cameras go into the water. And that was, and in a situation where my backup digital camera, the charger wasn't working, so I actually had almost no way of working. So I kept on working on the Rolleiflex cameras. I dried them out, and those old cameras are like boxes with a lens on. There's no electronics. So I dried them and kept on working, and the end result was kind of fucked up. There was a lot of damage from the humidity inside the lens. Depending on the kind of on the heat, there was more or less damage to the film. But I actually found it quite interesting to see the water making a direct impact on the film. and it's, I suppose, part of the kind of chain of thinking which led me to be kind of so kind of compelled by, the impact the water was making on photographs directly. Do we have a sound connection? Good. Okay, so let's. Bear in mind, this is a very rough video. It's just it's a 3-minute test to show curators and to show people what my 5-screen piece would look like. Sorry, I'm going to take it. Sound. We have no sound, but you'll see. I'll take it back to the start so you'll get the sound feeling.
इसकी गाड़ी टूटी पाया था Yes, no, beautiful under. No, we can go. We can go.
Okay, so I think I've taken you through all the various aspects of the project, so I'm really happy to throw the toughest, worst questions at me. I'm ready.
Yes, I'm very curious. But first, at the beginning of the project, did you decide to choose these float places, or it was casualty, the first photos?
It was, I was responding to the floods which were there, and I was looking for a way to make work which addressed climate change. And in a way, it was a series of accidents. Initially, I thought, well, maybe I would do a typology. I would try and photograph the victims of all the different sorts of climate change, drought victims and fire victims. And I actually photographed a drought, but after in 2007, I photographed a flood in the UK and in India. And I realized there was something very powerful about this symbol, the metaphor of the flood. It was, I suppose, visually a very compelling thing for me.
So at the beginning, you start with people who used to be flooded every year, in fact?
No.
No?
No,
Okay, it was
I'd say
exceptional.
every flood I photographed has been an extraordinary flood. In 2007, the flood in the UK was the result of one of the most extreme rainstorms ever experienced. And the flood I photographed in Bihar, which was, in fact, in many other, in Bangladesh and Nepal as well, was at that time reported as being the worst flood in living memory. So, although floods happen regularly in many parts of the world, I would say almost all the floods I photographed have been floods which are extreme.
So each time you take time to meet people, speak with them, you study the psychology, maybe it's useful to take a nice picture. You ask them to go into the water, or just you find them like that?
The circumstances are different every time. Sometimes, for example, when I was working in Brazil, just recently, many people had gone back to their houses. The water level had been above the rooftops. And it was going down, and they had returned to their houses to clean the walls because the water was still there. And once the water has gone, it's very hard for them to get water to clean. So that they were there to use the flood waters to clean. So I found lots of people in their homes in Brazil. In other situations, when I photographed in Nigeria, for example, I found a lot of people in sort of a displaced person's camp on the edge of a little town called Egbogeni, and people took me back to their homes. So we had a journey, sometimes on foot, sometimes on boats, to get back to their homes. So it's always an issue of, trying to take people back or photograph them in that context. And, sometimes it's a journey I do with them, which is a kind of return. So there is a sense that the images are quite constructed. I don't claim to be just, to find people in that situation. There is quite a sense of deliberately placing people in that situation.
And you decide to put yourself into the water each time?
Of course. Some of the pictures were done on boats, circumstantially. The very first one from Brazil, for example, I couldn't possibly stand. The place I photographed in Rio Branco in Brazil, on the river Acre, it was a area of the town which is frequently subject to flooding, and people often have to move because of flooding. But this year, the river Acre reached its highest level ever recorded. So the house where I photographed that man, it was built on stilts and was high already, and was 2 stories, and the water was above the rooftop at its highest point. So when I was there, the water had come down, and I photographed him at the door, but the house was on stilts. So had I walked back, there would have been 3 or 4 meters of water. So I could only photograph him from a boat. He was on a small ledge which goes around his house. But I prefer to be standing in the water if I can.
Did you save lives sometimes?
I've never saved lives. I've saved photographs. And in quite a few situations, I've helped people rescue their photographs, but I'm not a heroic person who goes around saving lives. And in fact, the moment that I get to floods is usually quite late. Sometimes with floods, there's a moment of crisis when people are fleeing, and that's often the moment when lives are lost. But usually I'm late. I'm there a few days afterwards, or even weeks afterwards, when people are going back to their houses often. So I'm not there usually in the life or death moment, thankfully, because I'm not that kind of photographer.
What is the strongest meeting you did with this project?
Well, I guess some people I have established strong connections with. Shirley Armitage, who you saw in the video going into her home. She's a woman who I met in England, and when I was photographing last year in Somerset and some of the small villages there, it was hard to find people at their homes. And I actually, I spoke to a friend of hers in the pub, phoned her, and we made an arrangement to meet her. And myself and my assistant Jo, we took her back to her home. She had left when there was just 1 or 2 inches of water. She and her father had left, and she'd actually had her house flooded the previous year as well. And that year there'd been about 6 inches of water, so she hadn't expected it to be that high. And what was very upsetting for her is that she had a whole box of photographs on a table, and the water had knocked all the photographs into the water. So I kind of filmed her going into her home, and then she was really upset by the loss of the photographs. So me and Jo, my assistant, we spent ages, fishing her photographs out, out of the water, and then helping her dry them out upstairs. But I think having experienced with her going into it, she was deeply shocked by that experience, and kind of gone into the home with her. We kind of, I suppose, established quite a bond, and so I've stayed in touch with her through the kind of long process of house being fixed and cleaned up, and all the nightmare with insurance and everything. And she's quite a vulnerable, difficult person, but she's been, I suppose, quite engaged with the photographs and how they're seen and used. So the visual connection is always very important to me, and you saw the cameras that I use. I shoot with old Rolleiflex cameras, and I think that helps in many ways. On one level, I don't have so I'll show you. I'm holding a camera down here. I'm not holding a camera in front of my eyes. So there isn't a camera between me and my subject, and I'm working very, very hard on people's expression. And in a way, I'm kind of waiting for a quiet moment. It's a very hectic. It's a strange thing because it's a very hectic situation to be photographing in, But I'm trying to get a moment of kind of calmness in the connection, because that expression is the central part of Drowning World for me. It's the kind of the expression I get from my subjects, and I think it's often a mixture of kind of strength and vulnerability, kind of anger and pain. There are a lot of things in those expressions, but they are the kind of heart of it for me.
Something very surprising on your pictures is we imagine when we watch these photos, the family life, and most of the time the children are gone, so they are not here. It's very surprising.
Well, I think it's partly, sometimes children are sent away. Sometimes, people don't want to bring children into the water. In fact, when I was photographing in America recently, we went with the family. We went in the boat, we went to the house. They got in to do a picture, and their 10-year-old son was desperate to get in the water and be in the picture too. But I didn't feel comfortable with that. I could have let him, but I just felt I didn't want to be responsible for his health and safety in that situation. It's as I'm sure you can see, it's logistically very complicated. To kind of be there, to be in the water, to travel, across the world sometimes, to make sure I'm there. I get there in time while the water is still there. And as I'm sure you know, the kind of topography can be very kind of complicated. There's a massive flood somewhere. Can I be sure that the water will still be there when I get there, if I make the trip? And then once I'm there, being able, getting to the flood, knowing where to go, traveling through the water, finding boats, finding vehicles. It's expensive and very hard, and I always try and find very good local people to work with. I think the key is always getting a very good local fixer and translator to be my kind of eyes and my guide.
Was it really dangerous sometimes?
I try and be as safe as I can. I think the greatest danger is usually to my cameras. I mean, I can swim. I don't think I've been in any particular real danger. I wouldn't want to paint myself as a heroic action sort of, risk-taking photographer, because that's not what I do.
And what was the reaction of people who you photograph? What did you tell them to let them be photographed like that?
I always explain the project to people. In most cases, people respond very warmly. I mean, you can see what they kind of give me in kind of visually in the situation. I think frequently with floods, people are very angry. They're angry with authorities. They're angry with a lot of the circumstances, and they want to show the world what's happened. And that's something I've got time and time again. People don't often ask me for money, don't often ask me for anything, but I think there's a sense of having what's happened to them witnessed is really quite important to them.
Now we are in the middle of the COP21 in Paris. Do you think that the role to play to the artist is stronger than negotiation, journalist work?
It's very hard question to answer. I mean, I think we can be. I don't think art can do anything by itself, but it can be part of a river of actions. So I think it's important to for me, my work has been used in a lot of different contexts. It's been part of the march. It was part of the march. It was part of the events last Sunday in London and Paris. But art's very easy to ignore as well. I mean, I think it's much harder to ignore people who are sitting down in the street and refusing to move. I can have my picture up on billboards and in galleries and all kinds of contexts, but are people going to do anything? I don't know. I mean, another issue I've been involved in photographing over the years. I was very involved in photographing issues around HIV and AIDS and the battle in Africa for access to medication. And around the turn of the century, I was very closely involved with an organization called Treatment Access Campaign, which was campaigning for people in Africa to have equal access to life-saving medications. And there, in retrospect, it was very clear that some of the work that I and other artists were doing was actually quite instrumental in helping to change opinions and get governments to act. So I think, but in this situation with incredibly complicated things going on, and I know at the conference site there were, all kinds of arts organizations fighting each other for access to space, applying to show work, applying to get the work shown. And my work isn't actually being shown over there, but it's been shown in all kinds of other locations, and it's been in a variety of media locations. I hope it can have an effect, but I certainly don't know. I mean, what do you think? Coming from your side, your kind of scientific journalistic point of view.
I am asking myself because, for example, the recent boy found on the sun with a refugee crisis in Europe, people they didn't listen to the problem, and suddenly they see a picture and they open the eyes. And I asking to myself if a photographer can be stronger than a politic.
It's a strange thing. Which images do that? I know a friend of mine, Fred Richard, is trying to do an analysis of why certain pictures turn the switch, because that image was a key one, and they're not necessarily good pictures, but it's a particular thing which is photographed. The famous picture of the child being, with napalm from Vietnam, also caused huge political impact, but it's very difficult to know what image would do that.
Something very cynical. It can be because you received a lot of prestigious prizes for this work, and maybe you are seen as an artist, and they forget the people on the picture, no?
Well, I guess that is conundrum about being a photographer who works in the real world, because I am, I suppose, making art out of people's lives and people's pain. I like to think it's with people's permission and that they appreciate, and you know, many of the people who have, you know, I photographed have come along to exhibitions and to events when the images have been used. But I guess I mean, am I a vulture kind of promoting myself and promoting my own art through disaster in the world? I guess that's a question which, you know, I suppose if you're serious, you always have to kind of ask yourself. And I think maybe there's a kind of continuum, you know, a line of, you know, on the one hand, working as a kind of a self-obsessed kind of creative artist, on the other hand, wanting your work to be really used and be part of activism and be part of a force for change. And I think sometimes work which is of the highest artistic standard is much more effective. You know, I mean, you can be an activist and you can try and, you know, take pictures to do things, but actually if the pictures are rubbish, they're much less effective. So I think having a strong artistic component in images makes them much more powerful tools. I suppose, I mean, you can think that in some ways, you know, for a lot of my work, I try and make, what you could call from a Marxist perspective, you'd call tools of visual activism. You know, tools which can work and can try and do something. And if they are powerful images and speak powerfully, they can, I believe, you know, be more effective.
Do you think, like, now for you it's like an obsession? You will follow going to countries all over the world just to see float places, float people?
Okay, well, I think it's time for a confession.
Ah, yes, this is time for confession.
Okay, well, over the years, I think I've come to love being in flood zones. Part of me, the photographer in me, finds something, you know, when I'm in a flood, there's something about the focus I find, you know, and but the atmosphere of being in a flooded environment, for me, is very special. I mean, and it's the way the light and the color and the reflections work make it a visually very rich place for me. But I think the fact that everything is upside down and disturbed, and nothing is where it's meant to be, you know, the kind of reversal of life in a flood zone, is something maybe I've become kind of addicted to. But for my own sanity, I don't want this project to continue forever. And I'm hoping to draw to some sort of conclusion in the next year or two. You know, I would like to do one or maybe somewhere between 1 and 3 more trips. It's very hard to predict where floods are going to be, but I would like to include China, you know, sort of an Asian country like China or Japan in the project, because they are such, you know, they're so important in the kind of response to climate change and in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases those economies emit. So the topography of China is quite difficult, though, because there are many floods. I'm sure you know, floods are very frequent in China, but they never seem to last very long. They tend, you know, because they often are on rivers. Apparently, they never last more than 2 or 3 days. So the challenge is kind of getting myself to China and being there at the right moment. So I'm always looking at those kinds of kind of complex logistics.
Yes, if I understand, you're not in a hurry to stop the global warming, in fact.
Well, I mean, part of the reason I'm doing this is I do have children, and I feel really worried about the future that they are going to. And you know, I mean, and I would, if I had a choice, I would much rather have no work and have no floods to go to, and you know, if it was in my control, I would prefer to be unemployed and have no global warming, because I am really worried about the future my children will be facing in 20 or 30 years' time.
Well, maybe we have a question in the public. You want to ask him something?
I'm going to follow on the Gideon on the political style. One of the words you said when you're photographing people is pretty much they're all angry. And are you angry? I mean, you know the game that's going down in terms of COP and trying to again create a world for your children. Is your emotion that drives you forward anger, or is it something else? And then the second part of the question, I guess, Gideon, is I know how difficult it is to get your work out there. These are awesome images, and I disagree with you. I think one of these photographs is probably an awful lot more powerful than 3 sheets of newspaper articles about climate change. But it is so difficult then to get it out into the public domain. And I'd be those 2 questions, where, I mean, are you frustrated that COP won't come up with what is necessary?
I mean, I do feel a strong sense of frustration with the global kind of dialogue about greenhouse gases and emissions. And I mean, personally, I think everyone is tied into this narrative economic narrative of endless growth, that economies are only healthy if they're growing. And with that in place, I mean, with all the talk of, 2 degrees and 3 degrees and, 4 degrees, I don't honestly believe, enough is going to be done. And I guess I do feel quite angry and quite sad about that. I think I feel quite a strong sense of compassion with the people I'm photographing, and I mean, and I think you'll see from the photographs that my connection with them and the connection I make through the camera is really, really important to me. And on one level, maybe I'm a witness, and I'm not sure how much more I can be. And I don't know how much more is possible for an individual. And it's in some ways a completely mad project to have been chasing floods all over the year for all these years and to make portraits in floodwaters. But it does seem to speak to a lot of people, and it has, over the years, it's been a struggle to get the work out. You're right. It's hard to get it seen. This year it was published in National Geographic and in the Guardian magazine. So I think getting it out in the media is important. It's also being used in different kinds of ways. As part of activism. It's being used on the streets as well. I made contact with, I've been in touch with the people at 350.org and Avars who are organising the events, and the more activist events in Paris and London, and I've made all the images available to them, at no cost to be used, and a whole lot have been used and are going to be used in the next 10 days. I like the work to be used, but you're right. It's very hard to get it out there in all kinds of ways, and I think as I've said, and it's being at the moment in Paris, it's being seen in the kind of extreme art context because the work is part of the Pré-Pictet exhibition at the Muséum de l'Art Moderne de la Ville. So it's kind of in an extreme art context. And it's also, I suppose, in a kind of extreme street context. So I quite like the fact that it's used in many different locations.
Do you think inequality is more the problem than the global warming, in fact?
Do I think global inequality?
Yeah.
I think it's part of the same problem. And I mean, one thing I've really seen in the work I've done is the different kinds of responses and the different kinds of resources available to people. So I think the people I photographed across so many different countries, they have a kind of shared vulnerability. But what they experience in terms of kind of often state and different kinds of responses to their situation after the flood tends to vary hugely, depending on the kind of level of wealth and resource in their countries. Yeah.
Question?
Thank you. I was curious, to what extent do the people that you photograph, do they connect these floods to climate change? Do they have a sort of consciousness about that? Do they draw those kind of parallels?
Well, again, that's a really crucial question, and I had expected you to challenge me on that issue as well. It varies immensely from, and it's sometimes almost a question I don't want to ask because I don't want to kind of make suggestions, and in some situations we've been to in Bangladesh and elsewhere, people don't really think about climate change, but sometimes they'll say, well, the patterns and the way the water works around here has changed and is very different. People I photographed recently in America came out strongly one way or another. They said, this has nothing to do with climate change at all, or this event, it's an extreme once in 1,000 years event, and it's clearly climate change. So some people have very strong opinions one way or another. A lot of people don't really think about climate change as such. But I mean, I recently, it actually never happened in the end, but there was talk of the photographs I'd done being used by Greenpeace in a kind of advertising campaign about climate change, and they wanted to use 6 of the photographs I'd done in the UK last year with a statement about climate change from each. And so I approached six people. We chose all the photographs and asked them, are you comfortable with your photograph being used in the context of talking about climate change? And they all agreed, and they all made statements about that. And they were, so and they could have refused, they could have disagreed, but they all actually felt what had happened to them was tied into climate change. But the challenge I was expecting was like, can you say this is climate change, these floods are climate change?
Well, it will be the conclusion.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I've had the question, people can say, well, floods have been around for millennia. There's nothing new about floods. Some communities are flooded frequently. What is the kind of solid science behind my work? Sorry, I'm being my own interrogator here. I mean, I think some kind of climate scientists I've spoken to have said that apparently many of the kind of most extreme floods ever recorded have happened in the last 10 years. But also, it's very hard to predict what the effects of global warming will be, but what many climate scientists agree on is that there'll be an increasing amount of extreme weather events, like floods and storms. So on one level, the work is kind of metaphorical, is that, I don't claim to have a completely solid scientific base to be able to say, well, this flood is directly linked into climate change, but so it's my metaphorical response to the issue. But I think from what I've kind of observed from most of the floods I've been to is that there's been an extreme event. Often the water, the rains have been kind of more than ever recorded or ever experienced in living memory, combined with a lot of human building. That there's a lot more, the floods in Thailand, there was a lot more concrete going down, and the same in Kashmir. A lot of construction in inappropriate places has meant that there's often nowhere for the water to go.
Well, Gideon Mendel, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you.